Prior to joining PG&E in 1999, Mr. Darbee held roles of increasing responsibility in the telecom and investment banking industries. He's a member of the Edison Electric Institute Executive Committee, serves as chairman of the CEO Policy Committee on Public and Governmental Affairs, and is a member of the CEO Board of the Clean Energy Group. In these roles, he has become one of the industry's most active leaders on the issues of climate change, energy efficiency, renewable energy, the smart grid, and other aspects of energy and environmental policy. Darbee earned his bachelor's degree in economics from Dartmouth College and an MBA from Amos Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. He has also successfully completed the Nuclear Reactor Technology program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Today's format will be different from our usual, which typically consists of a presentation with questions and answers at the end. At Mr. Darbee's request, I will be asking questions that he has given me. He will respond to these questions, and then the floor for each question will be open to the audience to ask their questions, so that it is a little more interactive than just me asking questions and Peter answering. So we'll start with the first question now.
Thank you. And it's good to be here today.
Does this work? Okay. All right. First question. What can the private sector do in terms of combating climate change and pursuing environmental leadership? In your opinion, what is the private sector not equipped to do?
Well, I think that there's a tremendous amount that the private sector can do. First and foremost, I think what's most important is for all of you and people in business and the like to educate yourself on the question of climate change. I did so when I became CEO of PG&E. I didn't have a point of view about climate one way or the other at that point, but what I concluded was, being the CEO of an energy utility, it was critically important that I know one way or another what my point of view on this was. So I think the first thing is that you talk to people on both sides of the issue, and we reached out to the leading scientists on both sides of the issue and tried to understand what their thinking was, what their background and the support for that was. Hopefully you'll come to the conclusion that is consistent with 97% of the scientists out there that the Earth is warming, mankind is most probably responsible for that, and the need for action is now. Having taken that approach, then I think the opportunity and challenge for people is to say, how can I play a role in this? One is to communicate to people the urgency of the issue and the challenge of the issue, and then secondly, to look at how you can have an impact. At our company, what I've done is I've tried to get the company to be as clean and sustainable as possible, but the other thing is I've been an advocate, particularly in our industry, to point out the challenges of this and to suggest to other people in energy companies it's better to recognize the change that is coming, to adapt your companies to this, and then look for the opportunities in clean energy rather than to fight it at every inch of the way and leave your company not well positioned when the inevitable becomes apparent to everyone.
Any questions from the audience on this point? All right, we'll go on to the next question then. Many states are proposing aggressive targets for renewables in the utilities portfolio. For example, California has set a target of 33% by 2020. How realistic are these targets? What are the investment requirements for companies such as PG&E? What are the barriers?
Well, my own view is within the state of California that we can achieve the 33% requirement. Just as 10 years ago, we set out to move from about 10% renewable power up to 20%. So given a 10-year period, I think it is achievable. I think the argument that I make in our territory and for our company is that it's really important to balance, on the one hand, progress on climate change and on the other hand, the cost to the consumer. And that's what I find many people in policy positions in the state and throughout the country fail to do, is to evaluate the implications of the policies that they have in place. For example, in California, because of a lot of support from the unions, there's been a lot of pressure that we should only have renewable power from within California, where unions are very powerful. The problem with that is climate change is a global problem, and what we need to do is seek out the least cost alternatives to deal with climate change. And the fact of the matter is, if we have a broader market that can supply renewables at a lower cost, that's consistent with fighting climate change, but doing so at the least cost basis. So our company came out and said, we're for 33%, but we want 33% available at the least cost alternative. And so if you limit the amount of renewables that can be procured from outside of California, we will oppose that legislation. And so we have done that. Alex, I think there's another element to the question that I...
What are the investment requirements for companies such as PG&E, and what are the barriers?
So the investment requirements can vary depending on whether we're going to own the renewables or in the alternative, third parties are going to own the alternatives and will contract for that power. Right now, we've suggested that our company own some of the renewables, and we're talking about several $billions. The biggest obstacles that we face is, despite the fact that the state has said we very much want to move to 33%, there's a paradox of collectivity. And that is, if you look at the different state agencies, if you look at the local agencies, if you look at the federal agencies, what you find is that there's an almost impossible gauntlet of agencies and approvals that are required in order to actually get these renewables permitted, sited, permitted, and built. And there's really a need at all those three levels not to pass more legislation, but to actually make government work and to align different government agencies with an energy and climate policy within the state of California as well as in the rest of the United States. So we don't, in America, really need that much more legislation. What we really need is getting the legislation that's in place working effectively so that issues like climate change can be addressed, but in a practical and cost-effective manner.
This is a question of my own here. What constitutes renewables in this context?
Okay. The answer to that question is, perhaps unfortunately, in different states, what has happened is that renewable power is a defined term, as opposed to what most of us generically would say is renewable. So, for example, eligible renewables in California are things like solar power. The wind power, for example, would be eligible renewables. But new hydro facilities would not be. Nuclear power is not considered renewable. Both of those sources of energy have tremendous prospects and opportunity, and they provide power without carbon emissions. And so I'm a firm believer that the biggest challenge we face on the environmental front is carbon and climate change, and therefore resources such as nuclear power or hydro power that don't emit carbon ought to be eligible and should count as eligible renewables. But in California, as well as other states, they do not. And that limits the tools that we have to deal with this challenge, which our board member, who's a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, former chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, president of the Carnegie Institution, has described climate change as the greatest challenge mankind has ever faced. And I agree with him on that. We need, as a result, all of the tools in the arsenal in order to deal with that very substantial challenge.
Any questions from the audience?
I'm curious, what's the number one priority for your lobbyists?
So the question, I don't know if everybody can hear it, so I'll repeat it. The question is, what's the number one priority for our lobbyists? The answer to that question changes from time to time, but recently the number one priority was getting the 33% legislation that we do want in the state, but at the same time getting it with the elimination of these barriers that I just described. So promoting climate change, but at the same time ensuring that we can get this power at the lowest possible cost. That's been one of the biggest priorities that we've had most recently.
33% requirement statewide, or is it every utility has to meet 33%? And is it profitable?
Could we get to
40, 45?
Okay. So the answer to the question is, historically in the state of California, the requirements like 20% only applied to the investor-owned utilities. And we found this totally inappropriate. If it's appropriate to set standards for renewables for investor-owned utilities, why would we have the utilities that government owns live by a different standard? So another element of our pushing for 33% renewables was that all utilities, government-owned, which there are a substantial number of municipal utilities in California, and investor-owned utilities live by the same rules. The other question was, is it profitable for us at that level and above? And the answer is, the way our regulatory model works is it's as if we're filing an expense report as an employee of a company and on the cost of energy. So if they charge us $40 million for a certain amount of energy, we get reimbursed exactly $40 million for that. So in theory, we should be able to recover no matter what the cost of energy is. What happens, though, is if our costs go up too high, we get rebellions not only from consumers and pushback, but sometimes even the same politicians who may have passed the legislation say, yeah, that's unreasonably high, don't pay that, which you can imagine creates huge problems for the utility involved. But that's exactly what happened in San Diego some years ago when prices went up. Public officials said, don't pay your utility bill. So therefore, in theory, we should be able to pass through everything. In reality, we're not. And that's why I think appropriately, utilities will support initiatives like this, but constantly are saying we need to do it on the most efficient and cost-effective basis.
Go ahead.
Considering that hydropower really ought to be renewable, why isn't it number one? Number two, can nuclear power be made safe relative particularly to Vermont Yankee, which is the whole contingent that is trying to shut it down?
Okay. So the first question is, why isn't hydro
considered renewable?
Right. And I think the answer around that as to why hydro is not considered renewable is a lot of the legislation and policy making with respect to renewable energy and clean energy has been promoted by environmentalists. And environmentalists have many different goals and objectives that they are attempting to pursue. And what they've concluded is there are whole groups of environmentalists that are focused on protection of rivers, fish, game, and the habitat. And they don't want to see dams constructed. They, in fact, want to see the existing ones torn down in many cases, and rivers returned to their natural state. And so for these reasons, these environmental interests have said, well, we want renewable power like solar and wind and biofuels, but we don't want hydro included. Or what they might do is say, well, let small hydro up to 30 megawatts be eligible, but we don't want a big dam. So that's been the approach that they've taken there. The other question was, can nuclear be made safe? And the answer is that we run a nuclear facility and we run it safely, but obviously there have been in the country events from time to time, 3 Mile Island being the biggest and best known of them, where there have been issues about safety. The reality is that there's a whole new generation of reactors that are far more safe than they used to be. And so I think with this new generation particularly, we can have very safe reactors. Some of the things they do, for example, a big problem with reactors is they have a lot of pumps circulating coolant. And so a lot of these new reactors work without pumps and use convection to drive the cooling system, as an example. Another thing that is done is if the power goes off in certain situations, what happens is that the reactor automatically scrams and shuts down, and will do so with the rods coming down under the power of gravity rather than being pushed in or pushed up with former technology approaches with reactors. So they're considerably more safe.
We'll go on to the next topic. You're a big proponent of innovation, but innovation necessarily implies some level of risk for which utilities and regulators historically have had a low tolerance. Obviously that's changed somewhat, but how much? How should the folks in this room be thinking about utilities and regulators' view of innovation, particularly the appetite for innovative but unproven technologies?
There's a lot in that series of questions. Let me mention, or try and respond to a few of them. Utilities historically have not been risk takers, and there are a couple of reasons for it. One, the consequences of errors when you're providing electricity or natural gas to a large population, the consequence of errors are very profound and can result in deaths, outages, other problems, dislocations. So that's one reason that you want to be very careful. And certainly if you're running a nuclear reactor, the first rule in the nuclear business is conservatism. Do things in a conservative way. So that's the first thing I would say. What I've tried to do, coming from outside the industry, as you heard, into PG&E, is try to introduce innovation, some degree of controlled risk-taking, with the belief that our industry is going to be subject to changes in regulation as well as technology. And I believe that there's disruptive technology that is on the horizon. And so unless we change and adapt as rapidly as we can to this new environment, then we'll go the way of the dinosaurs. And so one of the things I've really promoted is for our company to be more innovative. And recently, in the last year, it was named the 7th most innovative company in the United States. Not the 7th most innovative utility, but it was up there with companies like Apple, Nike, others, as a very innovative company. So I believe by creating an environment that welcomes innovation, that we will better position our company for the future and disruptive changes that occur from technology. I do not believe that a company in our position is a good company for creating new technology. The company I came from, Advanced Fiber Communications, was the fastest growing high technology company between 1992 and 1997. And I understand what a company like that does, how quickly it moves, how imaginative and innovative it is. And when you run a company with 20,000 men and women, it has $45 billion in assets, 15 million in customers, I realize that we have many advantages. We can deploy technology with scale, but on the other hand, we can't be as agile as technology companies. So we utilize technology and evaluate technology and deploy it at large scale, but we're not the creators of technology in the main.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, could you cite an example of the kind of innovation that you brought in PG&E?
Sure. So probably one of the things that has been the most innovative and literally out of this world is it was brought to our attention that there was a company called Solaren. And what this company would do is collect solar energy in space and then send it down to Earth using microwave technology. And there are a lot of people in our company that said this was totally crazy. and said, let's just dismiss this out of hand. And what I said to the folks was, I said, well, let's put this aside for just a second. I said, if this technology could work, it would be an immense breakthrough. So those that are familiar with solar technology know that you only get about 4 really good hours a day out of solar technology, which are kind of the 10 to 2 time frame because of the position of the Earth. At the same time, what happens is you have clouds also that further introduce problems. So, and the atmosphere itself also cuts down on the solar radiation delivered to Earth. So if you could have the technology absorbing sun without the loss from the atmosphere, without clouds, and collecting optimally 7 by 24, that would be huge, huge. So what I said was, what are the problems and concerns that we have as to why we wouldn't want to pursue this deal? And the first one was, well, technologically, the leaders like Grumman in the industry, Northrop Grumman, say this will never work. And my response to that was, that's what the incumbents always say. This will never work. So I said, if we could unload the technology risk on the company and not bear the technology risk, would that resolve the problem? And they said yes. So I said, let's go back to them and say, we're only going to pay for the power that's delivered. And if you can't deliver it, it's your problem and your venture capitalist's problem. And can you live with that? And they said, yep. So the deal is we only pay for the power that they actually deliver. The second thing is they were concerned that there may be danger of the radiation, the microwave radiation coming down, and that could hit areas that were not intended and create damage, harm, loss of life, things of that nature. So actually, having studied the military application of this in the defense system, I'm aware that the military has created technologies for shooting down missiles, and they use 3 lasers in that regard. The first one is for targeting, the second one is for adjusting the distortion of the atmospheric conditions, and the third one is for delivering the energy that knocks out the plane in a very powerful laser. And all of that technology is put up in a 747. So what I said was, I can conceive of how this could be safe. Let's find a way to inoculate our company against the safety issue. Well, the answer that the lawyers went through in the end was, so long as at every turn we reinforce on this company that they must meet the standards put in place by the FCC, who controls the radiation, and government bodies, that then they will bear the risk of harm to the public, and we will have protected ourselves against the 2 key risks and provided the opportunity for a great societal benefit. So we have contracted with Solaren, and that was one of the projects that was identified as to the reasons we were selected as one of the most innovative companies in the United States.
Charlie?
Your level of innovation is or acceptance of innovation and promotion of innovation is well ahead of other utilities. I'm wondering both, what are the factors that make that possible? Is it your corporate culture? Is it the culture of the region of California you're in? Is it the legislative environment there? And what are the prospects of replicating that in other regions of the country and other utilities?
I think you raise a lot of good points. So the question was, so why are we more innovative than other utilities, and can other regions follow suit? I think we've been fortunate. One, we do live in California, and California has, for a lot of cultural reasons, has had a tendency to adopt change more rapidly. I myself have a theory about that, and that is that everybody that moved to the United States sort of moved here, and then those that were most prone to change and unhappy with the status quo kept on moving west over time. And those that were happy with the status quo continued to live in New York, the East Coast, New England, and elsewhere. So I think it's sort of self-selected that people like change move into California. So there is a tendency in that regard, and that's why California is known as a land of first adopters. The second thing is, I think clearly the Public Utilities Commission is very committed to the issue of climate change, and their leadership there under President Peavy has been constantly open to change and adopting new technologies and approaches and strategies. So I think that's been helpful. The third element is that when I sized up kind of the situation at our company, I drew a conclusion that we really wanted to run the company like a competitive company, customer focused, operationally excellent, other factors. And so we've attracted a lot of people from all sorts of different companies in and outside. So I think in sum, California's prone, the regulatory environment is prone, and we've collected a group of managers and leaders that are inclined towards change and innovation, creativity.
Go ahead, Morgan.
In the example you gave a while ago about being innovative, you mentioned that you basically struck a deal with that company for power. And I was wondering, does your company also, say, buying stakes in interesting technological startups companies and providing capital, basically, investments? And if so, can you give an example? Or?
Sure. So the question is, to what extent are we, in effect, venture capitalists for technology companies? Actually, in 1999, before the energy crisis, in connection with the then chairman and the work we were doing, he authorized and the company authorized for us to establish a venture capital business, which reported to me. We also actually at that time started a telephone company that reported to me. And with the energy crisis, what happened was we were totally strapped for capital, and we stopped the continued sort of funding of those ventures, shut down the telephone company, and the venture capital company has continued, but not been particularly active under the name of Pacific Venture Capital. Now, we have done a number of transactions, but we don't tend to be in the technology development business, even that much through Pacific Venture Capital. Where we've used Pacific Venture Capital is some investments in distributed generation companies where we've invested in the model rather than in the development of the technology. So we've really left it to others because I think that they are better suited culturally and regulatory wise to develop the technology themselves. And we evaluate it.
I'll ask you save your questions to the end. We can move on to the next topic that way. As you've indicated, the clear trend is that emerging technologies such as the electric car are coming along. Will the grid be ready? What is PG&E doing to prepare in this regard? Is there any single technology on the utility side that really needs to emerge or evolve in order for the electric car to take off?
Yeah. I am a huge believer in the electric car, and there's more that has to be done before the electric car will fully be able to realize its potential. And the key area is around battery technology and how long the battery will last. If we succeed with the electric car, we can greatly diminish our dependence on foreign sources of oil. I am critically concerned, and you all should be concerned, that our dollars that we spend for oil and gasoline every year are going to governments and people that are determined to undermine the United States. And I don't just view this, but our military views this and our intelligence agencies. So if we can move to electric cars, we can dramatically reduce our dependence on foreign oil, and that, I think, is critical to America's future. The second thing is that the electric car, from an engineering standpoint, is far more economical and efficient than the internal combustion car. When you step on the brakes, you're recharging your battery. The torque curve in an electric car is a linear one that's very positive. So it will do a lot. Even if you generate energy from coal to power an electric car, it's cleaner than the internal combustion machine. And we know that we're shifting away from coal to natural gas and renewables. So it will be a much cleaner technology. So for a variety of reasons, it's very important to our future that we pursue it. Are electric companies in the United States ready for the electric car? Not yet. Can they be ready? Yes. What we found is the greatest indicator of those people that are going to use electric cars are hybrid penetration to date. And we have far and away the hybrid intensity in our area. Big problem is that an electric car uses as much power as an entire household in our inland areas, which is 3 times as much as a household in Berkeley or in San Francisco. And that means, so if a hybrid comes in, it's charging at 220 volts, it's like adding 3 homes to the neighborhood. And so we will have to bolster the grid very substantially to accommodate that. We're doing heat maps right now anticipating where the penetration is going to occur and starting to work on the grid to prepare it for that, but it's going to be a major challenge. For other utilities, I think they'll have the opportunity to sort of learn from both our successes and our failures.
I'll take advantage of my situation here to ask one of my own questions. It seems to me that we stand to make much greater gain even than what you described by simply encouraging public transportation versus individual transportation. So why not target that?
Yeah, there are a couple of issues with public transportation. Let me just say first, I'm a huge fan of public transportation. One of the lowest grades I ever got was a paper I did in urban economics here at Dartmouth when I proposed that we really push rail transportation and went through the analysis of that. You know, there are a lot of issues that people raise about it. I think one of the great issues that we should overcome on rail transportation is that we ought to be willing to fund railroads that lose money. And that is that if you look at optimal pricing, marginal cost should equal marginal revenue, and in the train situation, that number comes below average cost. And so what you want to do is, once you have a system up there, is you want to encourage everybody to use it. And to do that, you should have a low price, so therefore you should fund it with tax revenue and the like. So that's a concept that many people find abhorrent, you know, that we would fund something that loses money, but the economic solution, if you know your micro and macroeconomics, is that, yeah, you want to have the price low so everybody uses it and fund it with tax revenues. America hasn't quite, you know, gotten to the point where it understands that element of economics. The other thing is, mass transit like that only works in certain areas of concentration, particularly given the proclivity for people in the United States to love their car. And so there are a lot of barriers there. I think train transportation works best around certain geographic areas and population centers. So, for example, New York City is a great place where we ought to have the best train system in the world. San Francisco is the same, and I rode for many years BART, and I think it's an excellent form of transportation. So there's certain geographies where it works very well, and I'm a big believer that, you know, mass transportation is a good idea. It won't solve everybody's problem, but it could solve many problems.
The tax subsidized system is pretty much the system in existence in Paris. I lived there for many years.
Yep. And that's, economics suggests that's the way it should be funded.
Any questions from the audience on this topic? Go ahead.
So in terms of being the first mover in many of these emerging technologies, as you said, there's a risk involved. For how long do you think you can sustain being the first mover? Because if there's a downside to any of these risks, like in your smart meter, which was a mistake again by the regulator, how does that impact your decision making for the future?
Yeah, I have to say that the lesson coming out of smart meter for us was next time be second. In that, you know, here we were a leader and a pioneer, and because it got extraordinarily hot in Bakersfield, California. The norm in Bakersfield is 6 days over 100 degrees during the month of July, and we had a year in which 17 days were over 100 degrees, so 3 times as hot by some measures. And we had a tier system of rates that caused the rate system that people paid. The average rate's 14 cents, but as you use more and more power, the rate went to 20, 30, 40, and 50 cents a kilowatt hour. So without smart meters in place, we could project that somebody who typically had a bill of $200 a month, that bill went to $800. So what happened was people looked around and they couldn't figure out why their bill was so high, although they should have noticed it was really hot. And they saw the smart meters that had been in for a year, and they blamed it on the smart meters. We compounded that by a state senator who has a strategy of taking situations like that and really inciting people. And what happened was we created a scandal in the United States on smart meter. The Public Utilities Commission, to its credit, said we're going to do a very detailed structure, review here. They hired the outside expert, the best they could find, took 4 or 5 months to do the work. And the answer that they came up with was the failure rate of this new technology was 0.2%, as contrasted with cell phones and all of that, which are far greater, and with the existing meters, that was 3%. So in the end, we were validated. And so the consultant said, well, you know what the problem was? They didn't communicate right. Well, we thought it was a piece of technology, shame on us. It became something closer to the hearts of consumers. Every other utility behind us was sort of looking at that and saying, oh, we're going to spend 5 times as much on communications, and they did. So it will cause us to throttle back a little bit and think about where do we want to be first, where might we be second.
Next topic. PG&E is further along than any other utility with the development of the smart meter, and you've experienced some challenges as first movers sometimes do. What are you learning from that experience, and how is it informing your approach to growing forward?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, every other utility, both in this country and in Canada now, looked at the whole thing and concluded that customers didn't see smart meters as a piece of infrastructure. They viewed it as something on the side of their house. And so, rightly speaking, we have to take accountability for that and say we should have known. I think what we're trying to do is further reinforce putting ourselves in the seats of our customers and looking at things and saying, do we have this right? The other thing is, I think we're going to be more selective where we're first and ask ourselves, do we really want to be first here, or do we want to let somebody else go first in different occasions, and pick our spots. That would be the lesson. But also have a candid discussion with our regulators and our legislators, say, okay, we've been a leader, you've been taking the good of that, but if you want to punish risk-taking and you want to punish innovation and leadership, go ahead, but we're trainable and you'll train us, and is that what you want? Is that the message you want to send not only in our state but across all states?
No questions? Okay. The corporate and business climate has shifted dramatically since you were in school. What advice do you have for the Dartmouth student community who are graduating in this environment and trying to make an impact with respect to their career choices?
I still read in the Wall Street Journal and other places today that the job of corporate leaders is to maximize the return for shareholder. And when I was educated in economics here, the Dartmouth School really believed in Milton Friedman, and Milton Friedman said that was exactly right. And you should focus on that, and you shouldn't give money to charities, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. It's just making as much money as possible. And I believed that at that time, and over 35 years in business, I've learned a lot along the way. And I think what is very apparent today is that there's a great deal of disillusionment with both business and government and large institutions. I believe, particularly for people of your generation, It's a case of constituency management. And that is, you have to recognize, if you're running a company, if you're a CEO like me, that you have many different constituencies, and you have to balance all of these constituencies over time. What I'm focused on is doing the right thing and running the company right for the long term. As I'm in the later stages of being a CEO, if the average age of a CEO in the job is, I think, actually 4 years, I'm now completing 6 years, I'm starting to think about what should I do to continue the company and position it best for the long term, for the next 100 years. And so the question I focus on is sort of responsible leadership. And that is, you need to recognize the difference between maximizing profits this quarter in the short term and maximizing the long-term success of our company. And we've put together that equation, that algorithm, in a 5-point strategy. First of all, we need to know the needs of our customers by customer segments and turn that into operational requirements. We need to continuously, even though we're a utility, we need to be like a competitive company and continuously improve our operations to world-class operations faster, better, and more cost-effectively. We need to recognize that we have regulators and we have policymakers. And so our job is not to be arrogant with them and engage in a win-lose strategy. Our challenge is to create win-win opportunities and be collaborative with them over time. And believe me, that can be a challenge. And it takes a lot of patience and a lot of tenacity. The fourth element is, sooner or later, we're convinced that the issues of climate change are going to come home to roost, that we're going to have to run our company in a sustainable manner. And so whether it's with respect to carbon or other forms of emissions, we're doing all we can to run our business as cleanly as possible. The fifth element is, we believe that the decision by society to grant the corporate structure and let the corporate structure succeed is a grant that they can take away, or they can reduce, or they can tax, or they can regulate. And therefore, we feel it's important to be out there active in the environment, in the community. And so I've asked each one of our officers, we have more than 40, to be on the boards of local not-for-profits in our community so that the people in our community can see our people and know them for the good people they are. I go to Habitat for Humanity, and our people are building roofs on their volunteer time. I go to out at the parks, and our people are there. On Earth Day, there are 10 times more PG&E blue shirts out there than there is from any other company. And I'm proud of that. Our people are proud of that, but our communities love us for it.
Questions from the audience? All right, next question. As a business leader, why is climate change important? How did PG&E come to the conclusion that climate change is a top priority issue?
Well, I think I've touched on why is it important a number of times. I think what I would suggest for people on this issue is, like many issues, what I've found with the great learners and scientists in life, they come to the table with an open mind. And the big tragedy with respect to climate change is it's a topic that has become politicized. And therefore, what I find is you can't even have a conversation with some people. They're already shaking their head no. In my own family, that's the case. My own family members have sort of said, these are my siblings, they've said, like, you know, Peter's gone off the deep end. You know, he moved off to California and he did that. But I did something that they didn't. I had the opportunity. I think first and foremost, for me, there was a very serious question of conscience. You know, utilities across the world emit 40% of the emissions. It's followed by transportation that emits 30% of the emissions. So the question I said is, Peter, how can you live with yourself and your conscience if you ignored this issue and blithely ran your company emitting as much carbon as possible, and you found, you know, years, decades later, that you were wrong, and you and your company did irreparable damage to the earth? How would you feel as an individual or as a CEO? And then I said to myself, so let's say that you do that. And 30 years down the road, people say, wow, you should have known. You're in court. You're in LA. You know, I'm 70 years old on the stand. And they go, Mr. Darbee, didn't you know there was a possibility? Well, what did you do to exercise your diligence to look into that? And I said, well, I didn't look at it at all. I said, you know, I went with the Republicans. I'm a Republican, so, you know, there's nothing to it. Or what I did was I said, I looked into it. I found it was a problem. We did everything in our company to reduce the emissions as much as possible. And I went out in the industry and, you know, in forum after forum, explained to people why this is such a concern and that they needed to reduce their emissions and that we had to put a regulatory framework in place that would require that. Then I imagined myself on that same stand and my defending attorney would say, so Mr. Darbee, in other words, you couldn't stop the emissions at your company altogether, is that right? The answer is yes. So what did you do? And I said, well, I did everything possible I could, and I go through the things, and not only at my own company, but also with other companies. And so he would say to the jury, so this man was stuck with a dilemma, but he did everything he could do to reduce the emissions at his company as well as at other companies. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I find the company not guilty. They exercised the diligence and responsibility that we thought was appropriate. So that's the thought process that I went through. And then we conferred with the greatest leaders, you know, on both sides of this issue, and the arguments were compelling. So you had somebody who was a conservative Republican looking at this issue, peeling back the onions, really thinking deeply about it, and saying, you know, the evidence is substantially greater on the pro side than the con. We're going to run our company accordingly.
Question?
Is PG&E on its way to becoming carbon neutral, or is that not in the business plan yet?
The first thing is, if you are a PG&E customer, for as little as 3% of your bill, you can neutralize your position from a carbon standpoint. And PG&E was the first corporate customer to sign up for that, and I signed up for it as a customer. I can't believe that at only 3% you can buy offsets that will offset your carbon emissions, and I wish more were working to get more of our customers to buy that. We are working continuously to try and reduce our emissions. I can't see a way right now that we can get to zero emissions, but we're working every day to get closer to that goal. Up there.
In your conversations with other utilities around the country, especially in the southeast, how do you confront climate change, especially that?
You know, in the beginning, sometimes I draw the analogy to, I'm trying to remember the name of the movie having to do with the end of slavery. And, you know, the Englishman started out that process, and people just thought he was totally nuts. And I'll tell you, when I went into those meetings in late 2005, and people wanted to dismiss me as an idiot, you know, and, you know, just ridiculous. There were other companies we're members of the Edison Electric Institute. There are probably 100 utilities in that from across the country and some outside the country. There are 10 that are part of the clean energy group, and those 10 sort of think the way we do. So there were arguments by one chairman. I remember him saying, we're not even going to discuss this. We have looked at this, and it's not even open for discussion, literally, the reaction. But after years and years pressing this case, we were able to actually slowly, but through tenacity and you know, working things, we actually brought that group together in a coalition and agreed on a solution that was largely, but not completely, incorporated in the Waxman-Markey legislation. So we did that, and we were working on the Senate version. We were working with Lindsey Graham, and the troika of senators working there, Lieberman and others. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm going to ask a very crazy question. We all know that the whole world economy is run by the notion that the prices of raw materials should be kept as low as possible. So I think there is one fact we all fail to take into consideration, which is that some of those raw materials are not renewable. So in this regard, do you think those the prices of raw materials should rise high in order to help our Earth, in order to help protect our Earth?
Yes, in part. What we have is something that I learned about at Dartmouth undergrad in economics, and we learned about at the Tuck School, and that's externalities. And basically, you know, there's an externality when I throw a piece of garbage out my car, or if I were to throw a piece of garbage out my car window, just dump it on the highway, somebody will go along and clean it up. And so society's borne the cost of that, but I haven't. So with carbon, what we argue is there's a cost associated with carbon, but the emitters of carbon aren't paying for that. And so, long story short, that's why our company concluded that a cap and trade program was a good idea, because it would internalize the cost of that carbon emission, put a cost on it, and that the economy, on a, you know, being somewhat rational, would adjust, and there would be technologies developed to reduce the carbon emissions. And so we worked on that, came, you know, within some reason for 3 or 4 years in Congress trying to get there. Ultimately, that negotiation broke down, but we are actually working in California and are among the key leaders trying to implement a cap and trade bill under Assembly 32, Assembly Bill 32, which would roll out a cap and trade program in California. I like cap and trade bills because the cost of eliminating a ton of carbon would be about $10 to $20 a ton, whereas the embedded cost of a renewable is $100 to $200 a ton. So if we can get a cap and trade system working, it would be far more economical to deal with the problem of climate change.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I've listened to a lot of lectures here. A few years back, somebody was talking about electric cars and actually producing power from a power plant. And by the time it got to the electric car, both the economics and the amount of energy required to run that car didn't work out. The exception to that is hybrids. And the other exception I heard was Google. At their corporate headquarters, that's solar panels. And that's a nice way to charge up the battery. But that, you know, you don't have the transmission losses doing it right there. But you do with the power plant. You just stated a while back that the economics seem to work out together. Has something changed?
No, right now the economics don't, if you look purely at the cost of the electric car.
No, I'm just actually using fuel most efficient.
Right.
In other words, it's better to burn it in internal combustion engine than it is to burn it at the
Yeah.
power plant.
Okay, what I meant to say, I'm not sure if it came out this way, is that in terms of pollutants, that even if you generate your electricity with a coal plant and power an electric car, that produces fewer carbon emissions than the internal combustion car. And so it's a cleaner solution, and what I went on to say was, and of course, most of us in most states use only a fraction of the power generated come from coal. And if you're like California, gas and renewables, it's much cleaner. So I may have misspoken, but that's what I intended to communicate. It's not cheaper.
Well, no, I'm not talking about economics. It's actually using the same fuel.
Right.
Better burning. So you're going to get more energy out of that fuel than
I think you're talking about different ends of the process. You're talking about the energy efficiency in terms of, I guess, passenger miles, and he's talking about the efficiency in reducing pollution. Different things. Isn't that your understanding?
That may be.
you get more energy out of the gallon of gas than burning that, but where you're using it.
Right.
Versus burning it at the power.
I completely agree. Gasoline is incredibly powerful in terms of its energy content. So in terms of utilizing the energy from the fuel most efficiently, the internal combustion car is very good at that. For example, I drive a compressed natural gas car, and the second tank fills up much of the tank of the trunk because of the lower energy efficiency. So I will agree that gasoline has a very high energy efficiency in terms of content for volume. And the second point that you seem to be going at is it more efficient? I think it may be because of loss of transmission and things like that.
Yeah, I'm just saying you're going to use more carbon.
Well, I think what you have to do is ask what is the source of the generation? Is it solar? Is it natural gas? And while gasoline has a higher energy component, it also has a higher carbon emissions component when engaged in the internal combustion car or when utilized there.
I think, do you have a question?
Yeah, but you talked about giving your customers the ability to pay a small extra fee to have carbon neutrality for their power sources. I wonder what other things do you guys, or how do you put measures in place to encourage your customers to encourage you to become more renewable in the power? What kinds of measures do you use to help educate your customer base so that they can then sort of help provide the necessary incentives?
Well, we actually have a somewhat complex framework in place that's put there by our regulators, and we work with them on it, to encourage us to sell less electricity to our customers. And so basically what they do is they first make us indifferent to selling less electricity as opposed to more by a thing called decoupling. So if they project what they expect the level of demand to be, all other things being equal, and then if we sell less than that, they increase our prices to bring our revenue back to the expected level. So that creates a disincentive for us to do what other utilities in the United States do, which really they try and sell as much power as they can sell in order to make as much money as they can sell. What happens in ours, if we make more money, they reduce our prices so that we come back to the targeted revenue line. So we're responsible for managing costs and capital, but not revenues. On top of that, they provide us an incentive. So let's say we forecast demand to go up by 1.5%, which is a not uncommon level in the economy. If we can bring that down to like 1.25%, they will give us about 10% of the savings. And so for the last several years, because we've been able to bring that down, the level of revenue or actual kilowatt hours sold, they've paid us incentives of about $30 million a year pre-tax. And what we've done is we've introduced programs to do this. The first year we did it, we either sold or we gave out 1 million compact fluorescent light bulbs, and we convinced our customers to use them. And I have them all over my house now, as a matter of fact, because I've become a real believer in them. So that was the first thing we did, and we verified through market studies that people received them, put them in place, we're using them, and demand came down. The second thing we did, which is really I find it's so good, it's almost sexy, is we go into our customers, our commercial customers, and we walk around, our guys walk around, and they say, see that refrigeration pump over there? You should replace it. See that pump over there? You should replace that. Here are the makes, the models, and all that you can replace them. And if you do that, we'll write you a check for $15,000 as a rebate if you install them and utilize them. And what happens is I have gone out and met some of our customers who absolutely love our people. I mean, they want to hug them because as good as you might feel if you walked into a BMW dealership and they said, we'll give you 50% off, and you'd feel good about that, buying a new BMW if you could afford it. I don't know if you can, but if you can. You'd feel really good about that. You kind of hug that guy, or he gave you 70% off. You really say, wow, great. But at the end of the day, you'd be out, 50% of $40,000 or whatever, right? $20,000. But what happens after our guys do the work is that there's actually more money in our customers' pockets. And they're thrilled. And so they say they actually view our experts that work with them as like employees of their own, that they're not paying for it, because what our employees are trying to do is reduce the money they pay PG&E, and they love it. They don't know any other person in our economy that does that.
Well, we've reached the end of the session here. If anyone would like to talk with Peter Darbee, I'm sure he has a few minutes. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.